how cognition works. And so thank you for having me here. Okay, got it. All right, so what I'd like to do today is to share with you some work that is ongoing in my lab about how we're thinking about how attention is controlled and the different influences of memory and knowledge in that process. So like all good talks about attention, I'll start with an example. That's okay, it sounds just like my dog, so I feel very much at home. She's very naughty. I'll start with an example of visual search. So let's say, for example, you're a little hungry, a little peckish, and so you want to go grab an apple from like a little fruit stand. So maybe you run in there and you might look around. So your attention will be captured by salient objects like humans, but then very quickly will converge on where the target is after maybe looking at some objects that are similar, but really avoiding a lot of information that is irrelevant easily. Okay, so I think the typical models of attention would hypothesize that this activity of visual search is controlled by what is referred to as a target or attentional template. And this is the idea of a goal relevant representation, usually in working memory, but perhaps long-term memory, that sets attentional priority and guides vision or the individual to the right location. The template quality dictates the efficiency of visual search. So that's been sort of very well known and established for a long time. But there's an implicit assumption in this idea that the template is a veridical representation of the thing that you're looking for. So if I'm looking for a red apple, the presumption, I think largely in the field has been that you have like a red apple in mind, and then you use that to guide attention. So there are a lot of examples of this in the field. This is a particularly nice study in which they looked at how fast visual search could occur for a target object. So for example, this object here, when it's cued in this form and then shown as a target either in a precise form, exact replica, an imprecise form, or a different exemplar version of that target object. And as you might expect, reaction times basically increase monotonically with the change in the object from the cue. And this reinforces the idea that this is what you have in your head. And when the external world matches, then you're fast. If external world doesn't match, then you're slow. So that presumes that this is the good representation and this is the good target in some sense. But this isn't really what happens in the natural world very often. So vertical static templates don't work well in the real world. And this is because the real world, it has a lot of variability and a lot of uncertainty in it. So there are very few one-off situations where you have a perfect match to a perfect like image in your head of an object. And so what our lab is interested in is trying to understand how humans maximize the efficiency of tasks like visual search using learned expectations and knowledge and memories. Okay. So we kind of began this exploration with this example that's given by Navalpakam and Itti of looking for a tiger in the grasslands, right? In India, so you're kind of going on a field survey, your brain, and you're looking for a tiger here. And in the lab, what this looks like maybe is a task like this, where you're looking for a target. It's a visual search target. Let's say it's orange, but it appears in a field of distractors that are linearly separable from the target. For example, in this case, more yellow. Okay, and this can be contrasted with a more typical visual search situation, maybe where distractors are bilateral. That is, you're looking for the orange target and they're both yellow and reddish distractors available. And under these conditions, what you find is that performance is much better in this case than in this case. Okay, so sorry, this is work that a lot of the work I'll be talking about today is work that I did with the graduate student Xing'er Yu, who graduated recently and is looking for the right postdoc. So yeah. Okay, so performance is better in the sense that accuracy is higher and reaction times are lower for the unilateral condition than the bilateral condition. And so the question is why? And there's sort of two competing hypotheses that were have been put out in the literature for why this might occur. So there's the optimal sort of shift model that was the original model of Navalpakam and Itti, and other people like John Francis have also done work on this idea. And the idea is that what you do is you shift your representation slightly away from distractors, the yellow distractors, so that you start to represent the target as the redness in orange. So it's not a qualitatively different representation, but you shift to represent the redness in orange because it's more distinctive from the yellow distractors than the original orange. Okay, so you can imagine this as a shift in the target template just to the left here. There's another version of this, championed mostly originally by Stephanie Becker, and it's this idea that it's not an optimal shift in the tuning of the neurons that are of sensory neurons, but rather it's a relational shift or a relational rule that's being used. So here, it's kind of subtle in the difference, but it's important. And the idea here is that what is represented is just the reddest object in the visual field. So you're not looking for a specifically tuned feature like most feature-based attention models would suggest you would, but rather you're looking for a class of thing that is contrasted with the distractors, like the reddest thing. Okay, and so there started to be like maybe a little controversy, like maybe 5 people in the world cared. It's very exciting. But this kind of led me and Shinger to think about why these different models exist and why there's evidence for both. And I didn't go into it here, but there are differences in the tasks that are used. And this is something I'd be happy to talk about if anybody's interested. But we also had this kind of, I don't know, insight might be a strong word, but this idea that maybe both of these things can be true in a system at once, right? And so if we think about what actually happens in visual search, it's a cycle. It's a continuous cycle of looking at something and then identifying it as the target or not, and then doing it again. So for example, in this case of the tiger, what you might do is sort of guide attention to a location that is a candidate for being the target. And then you make a decision, no, this is not the object I'm looking for. You do that again, you guide attention somewhere else, and then you say, oh yeah, that's the object I'm looking for. Now I'm done, right? And so visual search is mostly actually rejecting non-targets as you go through your life, right? If I'm looking for my keys in my office, I probably reject 20 things before I finally find the right object and leave. So we wanted to test this idea that maybe the guidance portion of visual search and attention uses different information than the decision identity part of the process. And so the way she did this was to run an experiment like this. Okay, so the question was whether attentional decisions are maybe optimal and guidance is relational. So she set up a visual search task like here, which is very typical. And it was a situation where the distractors were unilaterally different from the target. So the target is this object here. You can see it's kind of greenish blue, and the distractors were all blue. Okay, and so this is a training sort of, these are training trials because it trains the brain to sort of recognize that the greenest item or the optimally shifted green version of the target is the correct target. And then we periodically introduce these critical distractor trials. So on these trials, there was another object introduced, and it's a critical distractor because it can have any one of 7 colors, okay? And it came from both sides of the target in color space. And it had a different shape, so subjects, when looking at this object, could always know it's not the target, but that their attention might be drawn to that object initially because of its color. And so the colors were both greener than the true target as well as bluer than the true target. And we use this as these trials as probes of what subjects actually thought the target was. Okay. And then we added this additional, this is an eye tracking experiment. So what we'll do is treat the first saccade as a metric of guidance, and then we'll treat fixation dwell times on that object as the decision process. Okay, this has been done by others, including John Henderson in sort of the scene literature as well. Okay. And then we also added these memory trials where we just simply ask the subject to indicate the color of the target in their memory. Because it's a continuous color wheel and they just sort of use their mouse to drag it around. As they drag around, the center color would change so they can get a better sort of picture of it and then clicked when they were finished. So these are memory probe trials, and we kind of treated them as the ground truth of the precision of the template. Okay, so it's what's in memory outside of visual search. So just as a reminder, we're looking at 3 different dependent variables here. We have the color wheel, which is the memory probe. We have the first saccade, which we're treating as a metric of guidance. And then we have the dwell times on the critical distractors, which we're using as decision times. Okay. And there are two models that we're trying to test and distinguish between. One is the relational model, where basically you look for the reddest item, for example, from an orange target in yellow grasslands, versus the optimal model, which is just a shift in the tuning of the target template. So because these dependent measures come from are just different from each other, in order to sort of put them in a common space, we borrowed from fMRI the sort of logic of representational similarity analyses. And we just created a similarity matrix for each of the dependent variables for each of the dependent variables. So this matrix simply reflects the similarity of each of these data points with each other. Okay. And so, for example, here you can see there's these would all be very similar to each other, but these would be very different from each other. And that's in this blue and red space. Whereas here, these would actually be very similar to each other, and only these would be different from each other. You can see this kind of cross kind of pattern.
Is that for the memory?
We will do this for all dependent measures.
Oh.
Yeah. So just to put it in a common space for the models. Okay, so first, so the memory probe trials. What did we find? Well, we found, as you can imagine, something that looks really pretty precise, that people were pretty good at this. And if you look at the similarity matrix that's derived from the click profile, you can just kind of see with your eyeballs that it clearly matches this optimal model. So there is a shift in the representation of what people are remembering as the target color. So the shift is to the left. So it's, in this case, greener than it really is because the distractors are bluish. And this is clearly going to be, this was a good fit, and this was a poor fit. So the more interesting question is with regards to the first saccade and the dwell times, right? So we had hypothesized that the relational model might be seen in guidance, whereas the optimal model would occur more in decisions where identity is accuracy and identification is important. So I'll just put up the data here in terms of the first saccades as a function of the critical distractor color. So again, the distractors were bluish, the target is here at 0, and these critical distractors are greener than the true target. So you can just see, right off the bat that, it's not a perfect relational model fit, but people are making a lot of saccades to the greener critical distractor and very few to the bluish ones. However, if you look at dwell times, it has a really different pattern. So the dwell time data, it looks like their decisions to decide that these objects are not the target are very, very rapid, almost like when they do go to the blue ones. But there's just a range in here, a shifted range that requires more time to decide that the object is in fact not the target. Okay, so in this case, they could also use shape once they get there to help them make that decision. But you can see that that's equivalent across all of these distractors. So it can't be the full explanation for cannot explain what's going on here. So if we play the same game and sort of create similarity matrices and then compare against these two models, it won't be surprising that the first saccades look like the relational model, okay, and the dwell times look like the optimal model. There's, of course, some mixing in the data. So the relational model has that little sort of downward slope that's a little bit like the optimal one. The dwell times have kind of a fatter leftward distribution, kind of suggests a little bit like the relational model. But statistically, there's going to be a clear correlation with one versus the other model. Okay, so this was kind of nice. And it looked like decisions were optimal and guidance was relational. And there could be a number of reasons for this that, including things like peripheral vision being fuzzier. That's something we have been testing, as well as just the idea that first saccades are cheap, right? And so having a fuzzy representation guide those makes plenty of sense. You don't need to be that accurate. You're just localizing objects. But whereas when you're looking at it, you have to be accurate in order to make identification, which is binary and high stakes. Okay. So we wanted to sort of seek more evidence for this idea that decisions look optimal. And we wanted to know if these decisions look like other decisions, perceptual decisions that one might make. So we wanted to find if there was any evidence for shifting in sort of typical decision processes. So we ran an experiment that was very similar to what we had done before. So again, we had these visual search trials that trained the individual to shift the representation of the target to be greener, for example, than it really was, given the blue distractors. And then we introduced these match to sample probe trials where only one object was displayed and they had to simply say yes or no, this is the target or not. Okay, so the fMRI data I'll show you come from these trials, because we all know that visual search is super messy and there's many processes that go on, and bold is just not great at that. We do, again, just like with the critical distractors, we have probe trials that come from the greener range, then the actual target, and then the bluer range. And what you see is that the target yes responses look kind of like the optimal model. So this is a decision that you're looking at a single stimulus and you decide yes or no, this is the target. And it's not quite as clean as behavior, but you can still see that cross in this pattern. One always needs like another condition to contrast against, right? And so we wanted to compare this template and see which areas in the brain might have this sort of profile compared to a veridical template. So this is just like if there was no shifting and you just have like very accurate tuning over the actual target, this is what that information should, that pattern should look like. Okay. And of course you can partial each other out because they do overlap and correlate with each other. And you can get the sort of bias template model versus the veridical template model. And then you can just, go in the brain and look for regions that that have that pattern, each of those patterns. So we had some hypotheses about which areas might have the bias template pattern, right? So like it's obvious to think that lateral frontal cortex would hold that sort of decision process. And so we use the Schaefer Atlas first to identify ROIs that would be in these sort of control regions versus visual regions. Okay, so I'm going to gloss over a lot of stuff. So if anybody has any questions, feel free to interrupt. But what you can see is that interestingly, so PFC does show this pattern where it's better fit. The pattern of activity in this region is better fit by the biased model compared to the veridical one. But interestingly, in visual cortex, it's the opposite. So in visual cortex, you're still coding the stimulus as the stimulus. And the nice thing about this is it suggests that there's some sort of readout from visual cortex that's accurate, but then that becomes reinterpreted in the decision process by the frontal cortex to sort of maximize the ability to distinguish targets from distractors, and that this gets held in memory. Yeah.
Just a quick clarification.
Yeah.
Is it always blue and green? And does it need to be always?
Yeah, so no, it's not always blue and green. That's an example that we use. It's always obviously counterbalanced. So sometimes the distractors are green and the target is in this in the other direction. We've used many different colors. Not all colors behave the same, it's true, but like purple and pinks behave really well. There's yellows actually don't very well sometimes, but yellow is a very narrow category. And so there are some idiosyncratic differences between colors that's interesting.
I'm just wondering about the linear distance. Is it really mapped to a linear distance in the way we code colors? So, we have this color wheel, but it's a construct, right? We don't really know if the distance between your green to this green or this blue is really
right.
linear the way we perceive it. Right?
Yeah. Well, you can ask this question in a number of ways. And then so sometimes we've tried to measure like the J and D of like a space that we're using. And you can do this in different ways, but more or less you get the same results. Yeah, that's a good question though. Okay, so then you can sort of play this game in the whole brain as well, because you might say, well, maybe you sort of selectively look at these ROIs, but you get, it might look different when you look at the whole brain. But in fact, when we do a whole brain searchlight with the biased RDM, again, you see these really nice pattern in the lateral prefrontal cortex. You actually see some other stuff as well, like in ACC and then a little bit in parietal cortex. But true to the ROI analyses, when you do the searchlight with a vertical RDM, the similarity matrix, you see a lot of stuff in visual cortex. Okay. So yeah, that's just a sort of very brief introduction to the idea that there are these decision processes. They look like perceptual decision processes that are used in any number of cases, but they seem to be applied to the visual search look identify cycle in ways that can account for some of the efficiencies that we see in the data. So just as a brief like interim summary, like this is kind of leading us to think that, well, we saw that guidance looks relational and decisions optimal. And this is leading us to think about this in as sort of a general principle that we use the good enough information for each stage of visual search. But what it means to be good enough is different for guidance, which is about localization, and comparative for decisions, which is about identification. So in one case, you really don't need precise information. You just need good enough information to get to some place where then you can make a more a targeted, more precise decision about something. And both of these are guided by the template in memory. Okay. So there's a lot of things to look at here, and we're just sort of beginning on this sort of exploration. So if this is true, then we should find that guidance and decisions, more than in just this case, rely on separable information. They don't have to use separate information, but it's separable. We might also find that they're supported by different brain mechanisms. So for example, guidance could be set by sort of attentional priority in sort of the classic attentional way, but decisions might sort of rely on different information that is more sort of classic frontal decision making. And they might also operate in principle on different levels of precision. And there's lots of things that can matter here, including perceptual factors, as well as other factors that are interesting to explore. So what I like to do now is just to give you 3 examples if there's time. If not, I'll just do 2 of how we're looking at whether guidance and decisions rely on separable information. So one will be a conjunction search case, one will be a learned association case, and then the third, if we get there, will have to do with learned variability. Okay, so these are just 3 examples of how we're trying to look at this problem. Okay, so for 2-feature conjunction search, this is the paradigm, again, that Shinger has been running. So it's, again, an eye tracking experiment. So this was all done post-pandemic, so all the data I'll show you now is unpublished. And it's a classic sort of visual search task where you begin with a fixation cross, and then you're given a cue. So this cue has an orientation and a color, and this is the target. Okay, I think there's 9 different cues. So on every trial, there's something unexpected about what it is that you're supposed to hold in working memory. After a period of time, you see these 4 objects. Each one has a number inside, and you're supposed to press the button corresponding to the number inside the target object. So in this case, I think it's number 1. Okay, and the key here is this critical distractor that is located down here. And it's going to vary from the target in terms of its similarity for color and orientation at 3 different levels. So again, we're going to use the first saccade as a proxy for the metric, as a metric of guidance. And then we'll look at fixation duration as a metric of the decisions. Okay, so the critical distractor kind of has this 3x3 feature space. So color is not showing up super well. But what she did here was to try to measure the J&D of color and orientation, because we know that color and orientation behave differently. So they're not equivalent feature spaces, and it's actually really hard to equate between those 2. So try to avoid the apples and oranges problem, although to some degree it doesn't matter in this case. She did a J&D task where she showed people something that they had to hold in memory, and then made a decision whether a stimulus was the same or different. So it's not your typical J&D, but it's more like what they're doing in the visual search task. So we thought that would be a better measure. And so 8 degrees is the J&D that she discovered for color in this case, and 10 degrees for orientation. So each of these items differs in some numbers of J&D on each dimension. Okay. All right. And so the color is, the question is, does color and orientation contribute differently to the guidance and decision portion of the task, right? Because you have a conjunction search, but who's to say that you use both features simultaneously and equally? Okay, so if you look at first the guidance data, so what I'm plotting here on the x-axis is the distractor, the distractor's color distance from the target. Okay, so this is a distractor that's very close in color to the distractor 1 J&D apart. This is 2, and this is 4 J&D apart. And then with the different lines here are based on orientation distance from the target. So this is this light blue is a distractor that is very similar in orientation to the target and marching on outwards. But what you see, first of all, in guidance is that orientation basically makes no difference, right? So these lines are completely on top of each other, but you see this nice effect of color. So the further away the critical distractor is from the target in color, the less likely you are to look at it. okay? And that makes sense. But what this suggests is that in the guidance phase, people in our experiment are basically only using color to pick which object to look at. So this would suggest that guidance is using color. But in contrast to that, during the decision phase, where we're measuring fixation duration on the critical distractor, you can see that there are influences of both, and the interaction is significant. So they're using color information as well as orientation information to make the final decision about whether that object is indeed the target or not. Okay, so consistent with the hypothesis that guidance is fuzzy and sort of a first pass, whereas decisions are sort of more specific and higher stakes, you use more precise information. We see that sort of distinction here. So we can look at also reaction time and accuracy, just as a sort of holistic measure of behavior. And what you see here is more mixed. And it's actually interesting that you get slightly different effects in reaction time and accuracy. So in both cases, you see effects of both color and orientation. And you can imagine this is true because both of these are sort of final outcome measures that incorporate both guidance and decision. But you can see that, that accuracy has a more exaggerated effect than RT. Okay, so this is just to say that maybe accuracy and reaction time are picking up on different information. This is an interesting idea that I was talking to Sanjay about this morning, where he was showing me his model and maybe why you can get differences in accuracy related to decision processes, and reaction time might show more what looks like guidance. Okay, so this is just a study that suggests that the use of even two features within a conjunction target might be unequal for guidance and decisions depending on the constraints of the task. All right, so the second bit of evidence in this domain comes from a study that Joe, who is a postdoc in my lab, it has been running mostly during the pandemic. So there's a lot of online studies, but there's very preliminary fMRI data. It's so preliminary that I was like texting him last night and he was like, go away, still estimating the model. So there's just one set of data that I'm going to show you. Okay, so the task is this. The subjects are given a face and a scene category, and they have to learn the relationship between those two things. So for example, you might say, this is Holly, she's a ranger, so you will find her in the forest, okay? And so Holly is here and she's always in the forest, and they do this training task until they reach some kind of criterion. Importantly, there's only one face, but each face can appear in 16 different images of the same class. So Holly doesn't always appear in the same forest, but she's always in a forest. So you'll see that the faces are sort of a 2x2 sort of race and gender identity kind of matrix. So we're trying to have these faces be as different as possible in terms of their target identity. The scenes are also a 2x2 matrix of indoor, outdoor, open, and closed, because that's something that's been shown in the scene literature to be decodable in places like PPA. So we're trying to play a PPA FFA game here just for convenience. Okay, so they train themselves to criterion on like who belongs where and who doesn't belong in each location. And this is really easy, and people can do this like easily in 10 minutes to criterion, even online, right? While they're eating a pizza. And then we have them do a visual search task where they're cued with a face, there's a delay, and then they have to find the target face and indicate whether it's on the left or the right. So importantly here, distractors always come from the same category as the target. So we're trying to make face identification somewhat hard in this case. And this is an arbitrary decision we've made in this task, although we've tried it to make faces easier, and you can see that the effects of the scene go away predictably. Okay, but anyway, in this case, when the distractor face is hard to distinguish from the target face, what you can see is that when the target appears in its home category, people are better, so we're calling those valid trials, than when it either appears in a different scene or the scene is not diagnostic of where the target is, or some combination of those. So we've run lots of different versions of this experiment, holding everything constant with the training and these valid trials, and just changing what the invalid trial looks like, okay? And basically all the results are the same. So individuals are more accurate and faster when the target face appears in its home category. scene category. So even though the task is to find the face, the category is no longer relevant the scene is no longer relevant. Nevertheless, people are using that information to localize what they think will be the target and then to make a decision about the actual face. So the accuracy is overall still high on invalid trials. It's like more than 85%, somewhere between 85 and 90. So people can do this task, but they're clearly taking a hit when it's invalid. All right. And so what we wanted to do is in fMRI is to look at this delay period and see what is pre-activated in that period. Is it the face or is it the scene, right? So it makes sense that it's the scene, given that we know that people are using the scene to guide attention first. All right, so this is the really preliminary part. So, what Joe has done, he's gone through each individual's anatomy and sort of localized PPA and FFA using a localizer. And then what he's done is to train a classifier based on the cue from the main experiment, because we have more power in the main experiment than we do in the localizer. Actually, there are more trials. And then to test it on either faces or scenes from the localizer. Okay. And the idea is that if the delay period actually, even though they just had a face as a cue, they're actually pre-activating the scene in preparation for the search task. We should see pre-activation or decoding of these 4 different scene types in PPA. And that is what we've seen so far. So this is only an N of 17, but this is the first hypothesis that we tested, and it does seem to be true. So this is using a boxcar, sort of regressor that is over the entire delay period. And interestingly, right now in FFA, we don't see any sort of decodability of a face. So obviously we need to do sort of more work here to look at just like an impulse response function over the onset of the face stimulus to see if, we should be able to decode faces in that case. But it doesn't seem like people are really holding this, at least in sensory cortex, while during the delay period, like they are the scene. And so this at first blush anyway, this is nice data that shows that there's pre-activation of the associated proxy scene in response to the face cue, because that's going to be the easier information to sort of select and to select first. Okay, so this is an example of a learned association where you use the association to guide attention, but then you use the actual target, the face, to make the decision about whether it is in fact the person you're looking for or not. Okay. Okay, so I'll just go ahead with this last experiment. Seems like there's enough time. So this is an experiment that a graduate student, Phil Witkowski, has been running in the lab for quite some time, and I'm just going to share one of the experiments with you. So Phil's interested in variability and in decision making, and so he ran an experiment in which he asked a question about the variability of targets, and it comes from the intuition again that when you look for things, they rarely match exactly what you are looking for. So even if you're looking for a friend, they're going to look different from day to day. Their hair might be different, their clothing's different. I mean, they might be wearing sunglasses or a hat and one day and not on another day. But there are regularities that you can learn that are more reliable versus others. Let's say she always wears a red leather jacket, right? So that's a really salient feature that you can then sort of use as a proxy for her, okay, if you wanted to. And so what he did is run an experiment in which you have a cue. Again, it has an orientation with this little notch here and a color. And it's just randomly chosen from like all colors in the color wheel. And then after some period of time, you get 2 objects and you have to do a little mini visual search for the target. So importantly, the target is very rarely actually the cue item, but it has some distribution around the cued item that it can be. And it's different, the distribution is different for orientation than for color. Okay, so the target can have any number of orientations and color, but which ones are chosen are governed by a distribution. So in this case, it's a between subjects experiment, again, online during the pandemic. But what you can see is that he varied the sharpness of the distribution from which orientation was selected in this case. And so it was either narrow, medium, or sort of very broad. But the distribution governing color was always really broad. Okay, so in this case, orientation is better information than color. Okay. There was also a control experiment where they both came from sharp distributions, and that will be used to normalize the data because, again, color and orientation behave differently, and it's hard to draw direct comparisons between the two. Okay, so we use the same sort of strategy where we use the visual search trials to train subjects on the variability of the potential targets. And then we interleave these probe trials to ask them what they thought was the target, either from memory. So indicate here the orientation of the cue, indicate here the orientation of the color of the cue. So this is about the precision of memory. Or we asked them to predict what the target might look like. And so in this case, it was a trial like this, where there's a cue, and then instead of having the visual search display, an object appeared, and they had to rank the likelihood of this being the target, given this being the cue. Okay. And so the question is whether people are tracking variability, and you'll see in the reaction time data and that they are. So then the question becomes, are they tracking this variability because the memory representation reflects that variability? Or is it not? Maybe the memory representation, which we've seen in other places, is pretty accurate, but rather that they're making predictions about the variability that then are used to, say, guide attention. Okay. So first, I'm just going to show you visual search RT data in these different conditions. And so this is data from subjects that experience the memory probe, and this is data from individuals who experience the prediction probe, but they're really the same. And what you can see is that so the light blue here is RT as a function of the distance of orientation from the cue. Okay, so these are RTs in response to very different targets in the high variability condition versus the medium variability condition, a low variability condition. And the way to think about this is that you're taking less of a hit from very different targets when you're expecting a lot of variability. Okay, so this is a regression model. So this is actually milliseconds per degree, which is slope. So, but that's the way to think about it. So that you can have a target that's very different from the cue. And normally we would expect that to slow down response. And that is true, but that slowdown in response is much reduced when you're expecting something that is variable. In other words, when you're expecting something that's very precisely related to the cue, when you get something that's different, it's very surprising and you're very slow. Okay. And there's a bit of a push-pull relationship here. So this is the sort of primary condition of interest, because that's the dimension on which we manipulated variability. But you can see there's kind of a mirror in the color dimension. So it's kind of like as orientation information becomes less reliable, people start to rely on color more, even though color is actually not becoming more reliable. Okay, but that's like, you know, those kinds of push-pull relationships in attention are not uncommon, right? Okay. But so more importantly, what does the data look like for these probe responses? So what is being plotted here is the sort of standard deviation of the memory for orientation and for color. So again, orientation is the more reliable dimension. So you can see that the standard deviation in their clicks is less for orientation than for color. But most importantly, you can see that this is flat. So people aren't being noisier in their memory responses as the variability of orientation targets increases. Okay, but in contrast, you can see there's a nice slope here in the prediction probes. And what this indicates is that their predictions track the actual variability of the target. So even though they're holding an accurate memory representation of the cue, they're applying this prediction to it that anticipates what they'll actually see. So again, there's a bit of a disjunction here between what is held in memory and which is accurate and veridical to the extent that it is, and the prediction that's made from that. Okay, so this is another version of how these two different codes can sort of simultaneously exist. Okay, so just to conclude, so what we found, hopefully, what I've shown you at least a bit of, is the idea that the target template that is used in visual search is dynamically tuned to good enough information when it's applied to guidance and decisions. So for guidance, the goal is to get attention to a candidate object and localize it. And so we would argue that that can be done with a pretty fuzzy code. It could be a proxy code. It doesn't have to be very precise because the costs of a mistake are low. But in contrast, for decisions, because the goal is to identify a target in a high stakes binary decision, you need to use information that maximizes the distinctiveness of the target from distractors. Neither of these actually have to be veridical, right? But at the same time, they don't have to be the same. Okay, so that's kind of like where we are. So the idea is just that there's a memory template, and maybe this is the most vertical representation you have. And it's kind of like everything you know about an object and a situation, from knowledge, from experience, everything. But then you sort of like pull out from that the information that is the most easy for the current moment to guide attention to a place that has a candidate object. So again, this could be a fuzzy information, could be proxy information, could be relational, but it works through sensory gain. Okay. And then you might use a different set of information for the identification. And this is tuned to optimize the distinctiveness of targets from distractors. It could be the same information roughly used for guidance, but it doesn't need to be. And both of these can differ from the actual memory. So I think this is just pointing to this idea that, you know, even a task like visual search, which we've talked about a lot in attention, is complicated and has these multiple sort of stages and processes that happen. But the interesting thing is that those stages might use different information, sort of rendering this idea of the template simplistic, right, in the way we've used it so far, which is similar to work that Sage has done as well. Okay, so I'd just like to thank the folks in my lab, especially Shinger, Joe, and Phil, whose work I shared with you today.